Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. The real lesson of Thanksgiving is to be grateful for the gifts we've been given. 2 years ago, the Washington Post published this article about Thanksgiving. The article said, America in the late 1500s and early 1600s was getting cooler and more prone to drought. The trend was part of a global pattern sometimes called the Little Ice Age. By Little Ice Age standards, the Pilgrims' first winter at Plymouth wasn't especially cold and the drought of 1623 wasn't especially bad. But neither were their troubles over. A decade later, 2 years of severe drought followed by a destructive storm brought famine. Cold weather, famine, drought, extreme weather, and death dominated the colonists' experience in America. The Jamestown colonists in Virginia were also nearly wiped out by drought and famine. We're very fortunate that we live in a time of warmer weather and a more mild climate. Humans now live longer, healthier, and more comfortable lives than any time in history. But it wasn't always this way. This is a memorial at the Bingham Hill Pioneer Cemetery in Fort Collins, Colorado. Many families in the 19th century lost multiple small children. A big part of this is that they were unable to keep their houses warm. When children get infections, it's very important to be able to keep them continuously warm. We're having record cold and snow in Colorado right now, but nobody is dying from it. And the reason is because we have widespread availability of low-cost fossil fuels. We can keep our houses warm, we can drive to the store to obtain food, and in an emergency we can drive to the hospital. People in Fort Collins in the 1860s couldn't do any of those things, and as a result many of the children died. But times have changed. We now have a generation of children who've never known any hardship. They live charmed lives but haven't been taught by the adults around them to appreciate their blessings. They've been taught that some horrible apocalypse looms just around the corner. It's not the children's fault, it's the irresponsible adults around them. One of the most irresponsible being Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont.
But the scientists are telling us that we don't get our act together within the next 8 or 9 years. We're talking about cities all over the world, major cities going underwater. We're talking about increased drought, talking about increased extreme weather disturbances. The United Nations is telling us that in the years to come, there are going to be hundreds of millions of climate refugees, causing national security issues all over the world. What we have got to do tonight, and I will do as president, is to tell the fossil fuel industry that their short-term profits are not more important than the future of this planet.
The reason that the fossil fuel industries exist is because billions of people depend on them for their day-to-day survival. If the fossil fuel industry stopped selling their products, civilization would collapse and billions of people would be dead in a matter of 2 months. And Greta would not be able to live the charmed life which she's living now. Senator Sanders said, "We don't have decades. What the scientists are telling us, if we don't get our act together within the next 8 or 9 years, we're talking about cities all over the world, major cities, going underwater." And here's the exact same story from 30 years ago. June 30th, 1989. A senior environmental official at the United Nations, Noel Brown, says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if global warming is not reversed by the year 2000. Coastal flooding and crop failures would create an exodus of eco-refugees, threatening political chaos, said Brown, director of the New York office of the UN Environment Program. He said governments have a 10-year window of opportunity to solve the greenhouse effect before it goes beyond human control. Greta is a child and she has an excuse for not knowing this, but Bernie Sanders was 48 years old at the time this 1989 prediction was made. He should know better than to fall for the same scam over and over again, decade after decade. And when Bernie Sanders was 33 years old, the New York Times and climatologists were saying the same things except about global cooling instead of global warming. New York Times, December 29, 1974. A number of climatologists whose job it is to keep an eye on long-term weather changes have lately been predicting deterioration of the benign climate to which we've grown accustomed. They point to signs both great, a steady global cooling trend since World War II, and quaint, the southward retreat from Nebraska of the warmth-loving armadillo, to support their claim that the coming years will feature colder, more erratic weather. Some recent warnings from reputable researchers in Japan, Europe, and the U.S. have so worried policymakers that last January certain scientists at a meeting of the National Academy of Sciences proposed the evacuation of some 6 million people from their parched homelands in the Sahel region of Africa. Also in 1974, Australia's Communist Weekly wrote about the same thing: West Africa drought horror. If sufficient action isn't taken in the next few months, countries would disappear from the face of the earth, United Nations Secretary General Kurt Waldheim said last month. So 45 years ago, communists were saying exactly the same thing which Bernie Sanders is saying now, except they were talking about global cooling instead of global warming. Now let's look at what's actually been happening since Senator Sanders was born in 1941. Crop yields have skyrocketed. Global hunger has plummeted. When Senator Sanders was born, the poverty levels in the world was about 70%. Now it's down to about 10%. That's been a huge improvement. And when Bernie Sanders was born in 1941, illiteracy rates around the world were about 70%. Now they're down below 20%. When Senator Sanders was born in 1941, death rates from natural disasters were extremely high around the world. But since then, death rates from natural disasters have plummeted and are now down close to zero. I could write an entire encyclopedia of the horrific natural disasters which mankind has experienced in the past. But that's not the point of this video, so let's just look at a few of them. Floods in China in 1931 killed millions of people and left tens of millions of others homeless and destitute. During one day in 1925, tornadoes in 6 states killed 1,000 people, left 3,000 injured, and wiped out dozens of cities and towns. The Red Cross described 1927 as being the worst year in their history. They reported 111 disasters, including 29 tornadoes, 24 floods, 23 fires, 4 earthquakes, and 9 hurricanes. The worst floods on record in the United States occurred that year on the Mississippi River and lasted for more than 6 months. These floods permanently drove hundreds of thousands of people from their homes. Descendants of slaves who homesteaded along the Mississippi River were forced to move to northern cities. Bernie Sanders' home state of Vermont also experienced its worst flooding on record in 1927. The 1927 flooding in Vermont occurred on the Winooski River, which runs right through Burlington, where Bernie Sanders lives and was the mayor. When I was working in Burlington a few years ago and living in Winooski, I used to ride my bike across the bridge and see the high water mark from this flood every day. Bernie Sanders has no excuse for not knowing about this. His third home, which he purchased for $600,000 shortly after the last election, is located not too far from the mouth of the Winooski River. Being 78 years old, Bernie Sanders has no excuse for his ignorance about extreme weather in the past. In 1937, the Ohio River flooded, causing waters as deep as 85 feet. The Grant Memorial Bridge was almost completely submerged. This huge roller coaster in Ohio was half underwater. In the year 1900, the city of Galveston, Texas was destroyed by a storm surge from a major hurricane. 10,000 people died in that storm. It was the worst natural disaster in U.S. history. On Christmas Day 1974, the city of Darwin, Australia was destroyed by Cyclone Tracy. 90% of the homes were wiped out, and the city had to be evacuated for about a year. And 4 days after Cyclone Tracy, the New York Times and climatologists were warning about the dangers of more erratic weather from global cooling. But times have changed. 3 years ago, the Washington Post was terrified by the lack of hurricanes in the U.S. Washington Post, August 4, 2016. Hurricanes, large and small, have eluded U.S. shores for record lengths of time. A major hurricane hasn't hit the U.S. Gulf or East Coast in more than a decade. Rational human beings would not be terrified by a lack of hurricanes, but the Washington Post was. And on the day after Christmas last year, it was reported that 2018 was the first year on record with no violent tornadoes in the United States. There is no historical evidence to support the idea that increased carbon dioxide levels is making the world a more dangerous place. This belief is based on superstition, not science. The Pilgrims and other early colonists were nearly wiped out by cold, drought, and famine. I'm making this video on Thanksgiving Day in a very warm, comfortable room. The reason I'm able to do this is because I have natural gas heat, natural gas hot water, and natural gas powered electricity. Tonight I'll be driving a gasoline powered automobile down to Denver to have Thanksgiving dinner. On Thanksgiving Day, I'm very grateful for the many blessings in my life. And these blessings are largely due to the ready availability of low-cost fossil fuels. Without them, life would be extremely difficult. The most important lesson that I've learned in my life is that if you don't appreciate your blessings, you lose them. The only climate crisis we face is from angry people like Bernie Sanders who want to shut down our fossil fuel supply. Without fossil fuels, the climate of places like Vermont and here in Boulder, Colorado would be unlivable for most of its current residents. The Pilgrims were nearly wiped out by the low CO2 climate of the 17th century. No intelligent person would want to go back to those dark days. Toto says happy Thanksgiving, and remember to visit him on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.